They said Precinct 18 was untouchable, a fortress where badges were licenses for brutality, where evidence vanished on command, and where even judges bowed to corrupt officers' demands. For 20 years, they'd perfected their operation. Every false arrest calculated, every bribe accounted for, every witness silenced, until they arrested Eleanor Davis. They saw a 78-year-old former teacher, an easy target, just another black woman to intimidate in their wealthy white neighborhood. 24 hours to process and forget. Instead, they gave her a front-row seat to their entire corrupt empire. Every conversation, every scheme, every crime. What they didn't know: Eleanor Davis had taught generations of students to stand up against injustice. Now, with her son, the U.S. Attorney General, about to get a phone call, she's about to teach these officers the hardest lesson of their lives. Sometimes the most dangerous witness is the one you don't think is watching. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine aisles of Thompson's Market, an upscale grocery store nestled in the heart of Oakwood Heights. Eleanor Davis adjusted her pearl necklace, a retirement gift from her former students, as she carefully examined the fresh produce. At 78, she carried herself with the same dignity that had commanded respect in her classroom for over 4 decades. The store's fluorescent lights gleamed off the polished floors, creating an almost sterile atmosphere that matched the carefully curated clientele who typically shopped there. Eleanor noticed the sideways glances from other shoppers, but paid them no mind. After all, she'd lived in this city longer than most of them had been alive. Officers Brad Mitchell and Kyle Harris stood near the store's entrance, their presence more intimidating than reassuring. Mitchell, a stocky man with close-cropped blonde hair and cold blue eyes, nudged his partner as Eleanor moved between the aisles. "Look at her," Mitchell muttered, his voice low but carrying an edge. "She doesn't belong here." Harris, younger and eager to prove himself, straightened his spine. "Want to check it out?" They approached Eleanor as she examined a bunch of organic bananas, their footsteps deliberately heavy on the tile floor. Eleanor looked up, her expression composed despite the sudden tension in her shoulders. "Ma'am," Mitchell's voice carried that false politeness that had always set Eleanor's teeth on edge. "We've received some complaints about suspicious activity in the store." Eleanor set the bananas down carefully, her movements measured and deliberate. "I'm simply shopping, officer. I've lived in this city for over 50 years. "Really?" Harris's skepticism dripped from every syllable. "And you often come to this particular store?" "I go where I please, young man," Eleanor replied, her teacher's voice emerging naturally. "This market carries specific items I need for my Sunday dinner." The store manager, Thomas Parker, a man whose pressed shirt couldn't hide his obvious discomfort, approached the group. His eyes darted between the officers and Eleanor, clearly having made his choice about whose side to take. "She's been wandering the aisles for nearly an hour," Parker offered, though Eleanor had arrived barely 20 minutes ago. "Several customers have expressed concern." Eleanor's hand tightened on her purse strap. "That's absolutely false. I've only just arrived, and I have my receipt from the parking meter to prove it." Mitchell stepped closer, invading Eleanor's personal space. "Let's see some ID, ma'am." As Eleanor reached for her purse, Mitchell suddenly grabbed her arm. The force of his grip sent her stumbling backward, and before she could regain her balance, he shoved her. Eleanor fell hard against the display of carefully stacked oranges, sending them rolling across the floor. "Stop resisting!" Mitchell shouted, though Eleanor hadn't moved a muscle except to break her fall. "I'm not—" Eleanor started, but Harris was already pulling her arms behind her back, the handcuffs biting into her wrists. Near the checkout counter, a young black man named Jordan Carter had his phone out, recording the entire incident. His hands shook with anger, but he kept the camera steady, documenting every moment of the injustice unfolding before him. Mitchell spotted him and broke away from Eleanor, storming toward Jordan. "Delete that video right now." "I know my rights," Jordan started, but Mitchell grabbed his phone, twisting his arm until Jordan's fingers released their grip. Delete it, or you'll be joining her downtown, Mitchell growled, shoving the phone back into Jordan's hands and watching as the young man, shoulders slumped in defeat, erased the evidence. Eleanor watched this exchange through eyes that had seen too many similar scenes over her lifetime. She remained dignified even as Harass roughly pulled her to her feet, even as other shoppers pretended not to see, even as the manager began directing his employees to clean up the scattered produce, as if that were the real tragedy. "I want to speak to your supervisor," Eleanor said clearly, her voice carrying across the now silent store. Mitchell laughed, the sound ugly and sharp. "Lady, you'll be lucky if we don't add assaulting an officer to your charges." They marched her through the store, past wide-eyed cashiers and customers who suddenly found their shopping lists fascinating. Outside, the late afternoon had turned golden, the kind of beautiful day that usually brought people out to their porches. But the sidewalks were mysteriously empty as the officers pushed Eleanor toward their patrol car. Eleanor noticed both officers' body cams had their lights off. "Your cameras aren't running," she observed. "Technical difficulties," Harass smirked, sharing a knowing look with his partner. The drive to Precinct 18 was deliberate and slow, designed to disorient. They took turns Eleanor knew led nowhere, making what should have been a 15-minute trip stretch to nearly an hour. She sat silently in the back, memorizing every turn, every street name, every detail that might matter later. Inside the precinct, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across worn linoleum floors. The booking area smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Officer Mitchell filled out his report with dramatic flourishes, occasionally chuckling to himself as he embellished the story. "Let's see," he muttered loud enough for Eleanor to hear. Subject became combative when approached, attempted to strike officer, resisted arrest. Eleanor sat perfectly straight in the hard plastic chair, her wrists still bound behind her. "Back. Those are lies and you know it." A desk sergeant wandered over, coffee cup in hand. "What have we got here?" "Disturbing the peace, resisting arrest, assault on an officer," Mitchell listed off, each charge more ridiculous than the last. "Had to take her down when she tried to attack me with a produce display." The sergeant barely glanced at Eleanor, before nodding. "Booker. Chief Callahan wants all the paperwork clean on this one." Eleanor's ears perked up at the mention of the police chief, filing away another name for later. She watched as the sergeant walked away, already dismissing her existence from his mind. They took her fingerprints roughly, pressing each finger against the scanner with unnecessary force. Her photograph captured her dignity even in handcuffs, head high, eyes forward, refusing to be diminished. "I want my phone call," Eleanor stated firmly as they led her toward the holding cells. Mitchell's laugh echoed off the concrete walls. "Maybe tomorrow if we're not too busy. Night shift's short-staffed, you know how it is." The cell they pushed her into was cold and bare, with a metal bench bolted to the wall and a toilet in full view of anyone passing by. The door clanged shut with a finality that would have shaken a less resolute soul. Eleanor sat on the bench, her back straight, her mind sharp. She listened to the officers' retreating footsteps, to their laughter as they discussed their plans for the evening. She heard Mitchell call someone, presumably Chief Callahan, to report that everything had been handled cleanly. Through the night, she observed. She watched officers pass by, some averting their eyes, others staring with open hostility. She noted how certain files were carried to a back room, how hushed conversations happened in corners, how the overnight shift moved with the easy familiarity of people who knew their actions would never face scrutiny. In the early hours of the morning, when the precinct was at its quietest, Eleanor heard two officers discussing another arrest. "Just like we did with the old lady," one said. "Camera off, clean report, judge signs off, case closed." Eleanor closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in calculation. They had no idea who they were dealing with, no idea of the storm they had just brought down upon themselves. She thought of her son Malcolm, of the power and resources at his disposal as U.S. Attorney General. These officers thought they were following their usual playbook, but they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. As dawn began to creep through the high windows of the precinct, Eleanor Davis sat in her cell, already composing in her mind the testimony that would bring this corrupt system crashing down. They had given her front row seats to their operation, never suspecting that every detail, every name, every procedure was being cataloged by a mind sharpened by decades of teaching and a lifetime of navigating a system designed to break her. The morning shift arrived, bringing with them the sounds of fresh coffee and casual conversation. Eleanor heard Mitchell clock out, his voice carrying down the corridor as he joked with the incoming officers about the troublemaker in cell 3. Little did he know, the real trouble was just beginning. Through it all, Eleanor maintained her dignity, her resolve, and most importantly, her awareness. Every laugh, every comment, every procedural violation was another nail in their coffin. They thought they were teaching her a lesson about staying in her place. Instead, they were providing her with all the evidence she would need to teach them. One final lesson about justice, power, and the consequences of underestimating a 78-year-old former teacher who had spent her life fighting battles, just like this one. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would shake the department to its core, though none of them knew it yet. As the morning sun finally broke through the precinct windows, Eleanor Davis allowed herself a small smile. They had given her exactly what she needed, a front row seat to their corruption and the motivation to tear it all down. Dawn had broken over Precinct 18, but Eleanor Davis remained alert in her holding cell, gathering every scrap of information she could. The morning shift brought new faces, new conversations, and new evidence of the corruption that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. Officer Mitchell's voice carried down the corridor as he finished his shift report. "Make sure the old lady stays put until we get all the paperwork straight. Don't want any complications." Eleanor watched through the cell bars as a group of officers gathered near the coffee machine, their voices carrying in the early morning quiet. Detective James Wilson, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair, gestured animatedly while speaking to two younger officers. "You wouldn't believe how easy it is," Wilson chuckled, stirring his coffee. "Plant a little something in their car. Suddenly that routine traffic stop becomes a major bust. Department gets another win, we get our bonuses, everybody's happy." He paused, taking a sip. "Well, everybody who matters anyway." A rookie officer, fresh-faced and uncertain, shifted uncomfortably. "But what about the body cams?" "Technical difficulties. Happen all the time, kid," Wilson winked. "Equipment malfunction, battery dies, footage gets corrupted. Just ask Mitchell about last night's arrest." Eleanor memorized their faces, their names from their badges, every detail that might prove useful later. Her hands might be bound, but her mind remained sharp as ever, cataloging evidence of their corruption. Down the hall, she could hear the shift sergeant, Patrick Walsh, reviewing reports. "Mitchell's write-up on the Davis arrest needs some tweaking, make it cleaner, more believable. Add a witness statement from that store manager. What's his name? Parker? Yeah, get him to sign whatever we put in front of him." "Already done," another voice responded. "Parker's got a history of shoplifting complaints at his store. Wouldn't want those to suddenly get investigated, would he?" Eleanor's cell was positioned near the evidence room, giving her a perfect vantage point to observe the comings and goings of officers. She watched as Detective Wilson entered with a cardboard box labeled Evidence Case Number 4789. Through the partially opened door, she could see him removing items, replacing them with others, carefully adjusting the contents before resealing it. A female officer, Detective Lisa Carter, according to her badge, passed by Eleanor's cell, her steps slowing as she glanced inside. Unlike the others, her expression held a hint of concern, maybe even guilt. She continued to the evidence room where Wilson was still working. "You can't keep doing this, James," Lisa's voice carried clearly to Eleanor's cell. "One day, someone's going to notice." Wilson's laugh was dismissive. "Been doing it for 15 years, Lisa. Nobody notices because nobody wants to notice. Chief Callahan certainly doesn't care as long as our numbers look good." Lisa's response was cut short by the arrival of Officer Harass, who burst into the evidence room with nervous energy. "Chief wants all body cam footage from last night deleted. Says it's a direct order from above." "Above?" Lisa questioned. "You mean the mayor?" "Higher. Harris lowered his voice, but Eleanor could still hear him clearly. Judge Whitaker called personally. Says this needs to disappear completely. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly at this new information. A judge involved in the cover-up added another layer to the corruption she was uncovering. She closed her eyes, appearing to doze but listening intently as Harris continued. The judge says we need to make sure this case sticks. Can't have any loose ends floating around. Wilson's response was immediate. What about that kid with the phone? The one Mitchell caught recording? Being handled, Harris assured him. We've got his details. One wrong move, and he'll find himself facing some serious charges. Throughout the morning, Eleanor observed a steady stream of officers entering and leaving the evidence room, each carrying files or evidence bags, each participating in what was clearly a well-established system of corruption. She watched as they casually altered reports, deleted footage, and fabricated evidence, all while joking about their weekend plans as if this was just another day at the office. Around noon, the atmosphere in the precinct shifted. Police Chief Bob Callahan had arrived, his presence announced by the sudden straightening of spines and nervous glances among the officers. Eleanor watched through her cell bars as he strode down the corridor, his silver hair perfectly combed, his uniform pristine. Callahan stopped at the sergeant's desk, his voice carrying an edge of concern. The mayor's office called. Wants to make sure everything's under control here. All handled, Chief, Walsh assured him. Mitchell's report is clean, body cam footage is gone, and we've got witness statements backing our version of events. Good, Callahan nodded. Judge Whitaker's going to expedite the paperwork. We need this wrapped up quickly before anyone starts asking questions. The chief's phone rang, and Eleanor watched as he answered it, his expression changing from confidence to concern. Yes, Mr. Mayor. No, sir, everything's under control. The judge is handling it personally. Yes, sir, I understand the importance. After hanging up, Callahan gathered his senior officers for a meeting in his office. Eleanor couldn't see them, but their voices carried through the ventilation system to her cell. Listen up, Callahan's voice was tense. Mayor Kensington wants this situation contained. If word gets out about what's been happening in this precinct, we're all finished. The Davis arrest needs to be handled perfectly. No mistakes, no loose ends. What about the store's security footage? Someone asked. Already taken care of, another voice responded. Technical malfunction. Everything from yesterday afternoon is gone. Eleanor heard papers shuffling, then Callahan's voice again. I'm meeting the mayor and Judge Whitaker at Morton's Steakhouse tonight. We need to make sure we're all on the same page before this goes any further. The meeting continued, with officers discussing various cases they needed to clean up and evidence that needed to disappear. Eleanor remained still, absorbing every word, every name, every detail of their corrupt operation. As afternoon turned to evening, Detective Lisa Carter passed by Eleanor's cell again, this time slowing to a stop. She glanced both ways down the corridor before approaching the bars. Mrs. Davis, she spoke softly. Are you all right? Do you need anything? Eleanor met her eyes steadily. I need to make my phone call. It's been over 24 hours. Lisa hesitated, conflict clear on her face. After another check of the corridor, she pulled out a cell phone. Make it quick. If anyone asks, this never happened. Eleanor's fingers didn't shake as she dialed her son's number. Malcolm answered on the second ring. Mom, where are you? I've been trying to reach you. Malcolm. Eleanor's voice was low but clear. They're hiding something huge here, something that goes all the way to the top. What? Who's hiding what? Mom, where are you? Precinct 18, Eleanor replied, watching Lisa's nervous glances down the corridor. Son, I need you to listen carefully. These people think they're untouchable. They think no one's watching. But they've been sloppy, overconfident. I've seen enough in the last 24 hours to bring this whole department down. Malcolm's sharp intake of breath was audible. Precinct 18? Stay there, Mom. Don't sign anything. Don't give any statements. I'm coming. No, Eleanor's voice was firm. Don't come yourself. Send your team. This goes beyond just my arrest. They've got judges in their pocket, the mayor involved. They're destroying evidence as we speak. Lisa tapped Eleanor's shoulder, Urgently, someone was coming. Eleanor quickly finished her call. Malcolm, they're hiding something huge here. She handed the phone back to Lisa just as footsteps approached. Officer Mitchell appeared, his face twisting into a sneer when he saw Lisa near the cell. Getting friendly with the prisoner, Carter? Lisa straightened her spine. Just doing a welfare check. Protocol, you know. Mitchell's laugh was ugly. Protocol? Since when do we care about protocol in this precinct? After Lisa left, Mitchell leaned against the cell bars, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. Hope you're enjoying your stay, Mrs. Davis. Judge, Whitaker's going to make sure it's a long one. Eleanor met his gaze calmly. Every hour I spend in this cell is another hour I spend watching you and your colleagues break the law. Mitchell's face reddened. Watch your mouth, old woman. Accidents happen in custody all the time. But Eleanor could see the first flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She'd been quiet, observant, present for too many unguarded conversations. They'd been careless, overconfident, never considering that the elderly black woman in the holding cell might be more than she appeared. As night fell over Precinct 18, the energy in the building shifted again. Officers hurried through the corridors, their movements more urgent, their conversations hushed. Eleanor caught fragments of worried discussions about an upcoming meeting between the chief, the mayor, and the judge. Through it all, she sat quietly in her cell, a seemingly harmless old woman who had witnessed everything. They had given her front-row seats to their corruption, never suspecting that every detail was being carefully recorded by a mind sharpened by decades of teaching and a lifetime of fighting injustice. In the darkness of her cell, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. They thought they were teaching her a lesson about staying in her place. Instead, they had given her exactly what she needed: evidence of their crimes, proof of their corruption, and most importantly, access to the very system they used to protect themselves. The storm was coming and none of them saw it approaching, but Eleanor Davis knew that by this time tomorrow, her son would have everything he needed to tear their corrupt empire apart. They had made a crucial mistake. They had underestimated a 78-year-old former teacher who had spent her life fighting battles just like this one. And now, thanks to their own arrogance, she had the evidence to bring them all down. Malcolm Davis sat in his Washington, D.C. office, his mother's words echoing in his mind. They're hiding something huge. Here. His fingers drummed against the polished mahogany desk as he processed the implications of her call. The U.S. Attorney General rarely involved himself directly in local police matters, but this was different. This was personal. Sarah, he called, to his chief of staff, get me everything you can on Precinct 18, and I mean everything. Sarah Williams, a sharp-minded woman in her 40s, who had worked with Malcolm for over a decade, was already moving. I'm assembling a team now. Do you want me to contact the local FBI office? Not yet. Malcolm's voice was measured, controlled. Let's see what we're dealing with first. And Sarah? Nobody outside this office knows about this. Not until we're ready. Within an hour, Malcolm's spacious office had transformed into a command center. Analysts pored over precinct records, financial statements, and complaint histories. The pattern that emerged was disturbing but not surprising: a steady increase in civil asset forfeitures, a suspicious number of dismissed complaints, and an unusually high rate of technical malfunctions with body cameras. Sir, one of his analysts called out, you need to see this. She pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop. Precinct 18's arrest rates for minorities are 3 times higher than any other precinct in the city, but their conviction rates are nearly perfect. That's statistically impossible unless they're fabricating evidence, Malcolm finished, his jaw tightening. Keep digging. The phone on his desk rang, a secure line used only for sensitive matters. Davis, he answered. Mr. Attorney General, Mayor Kensington's voice oozed false concern. I just learned about an unfortunate incident involving your mother. I want to assure you this is all a misunderstanding. We're prepared to release her immediately with our sincerest apologies. Malcolm's laugh was cold. Mayor Kensington, I'm afraid it's far too late for that, but I appreciate you confirming your involvement in this matter. The mayor's sharp intake of breath was audible. Now, let's not be hasty. I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone. The only thing that would benefit everyone is a complete investigation of your precinct's practices, Malcolm replied. And that investigation begins today. He hung up before the mayor could respond, turning to Sarah. Get me Judge Thompson in the federal circuit. We're going to need some warrants. Across town, Detective Lisa Carter sat in her parked car outside Precinct 18, her hands shaking slightly as she stared at the USB drive on her passenger seat. Years of collected evidence, deleted body cam footage she'd managed to recover, copies of falsified reports, recordings of conversations about bribes and cover-ups. She'd been gathering it all, waiting for the right moment, the right person, to trust with it. Her phone buzzed, a text from Officer Mitchell. Chief wants everyone in early tomorrow. Big meeting about the Davis situation. Lisa picked up the USB drive, making her decision. She drove to a coffee shop 3 towns over, used their public Wi-Fi, and sent an encrypted email to the Attorney General's office. Then she drove home, taking a circuitous route to ensure she wasn't followed. Back in Washington, Malcolm's team was building their case. Sarah entered his office with a stack of printouts. We've got something. A detective from Precinct 18 just sent us a treasure trove of evidence. She's been collecting it for years. Malcolm spent the next hour reviewing the files. Video footage showed officers planting evidence. Audio recordings captured discussions of bribes, and spreadsheets detailed the protection racket they ran on local businesses. But it was the connection to Judge Whitaker that made Malcolm sit up straighter. Look at this, he pointed to a series of bank transfers. Every time Whitaker dismisses a case involving Precinct 18 officers, a large deposit appears in an offshore account linked to his wife's maiden name. Sarah nodded. And there's more. The mayor's been getting kickbacks from civil asset forfeitures. They're using a shell company to launder the money through local development projects. Malcolm stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city. They got sloppy, too comfortable, too confident. He turned back to his team. Let's make them uncomfortable. He picked up his phone, dialing a number he rarely used. This is Attorney General Davis. I need a team of federal marshals ready to move in the next hour, and get me Director Phillips at the FBI. The machinery of federal law enforcement began to move. Teams were assembled, warrants were prepared, and surveillance units took up positions around Precinct 18. Malcolm watched the pieces fall into place, knowing timing would be crucial. At Precinct 18, Chief Callahan was in a panic. He'd just received word that Eleanor Davis was the Attorney General's mother, and now his carefully constructed world was threatening to unravel. He paced his office, phone pressed to his ear. We need to get rid of her. Judge Whitaker's voice crackled through the line. Transfer her to maximum security, lose her in the system for a few days. Give us time to clean this up. Callahan wiped sweat from his forehead. And what happens when the feds come looking? They won't find anything, Whitaker assured him. We've done this before, but they hadn't done this before. Not with someone like Eleanor Davis, not with the Attorney General's office watching. Callahan knew it, even if he wouldn't admit it to Whitaker. He hung up and called in Officers Mitchell and Harris. We're transferring the Davis woman tonight. Maximum security at state prison. Mitchell's eyes widened. Sir, that's not standard. Procedure for... Since when do you care about procedure? Callahan snapped. Get it done. What none of them knew was that Detective Lisa Carter was listening outside Callahan's office, recording everything on her phone. As soon as the meeting ended, she sent another encrypted email to Malcolm's office. Malcolm received the warning just as he was preparing to leave for the day. Sir, Sarah burst into his office. They're planning to transfer your mother tonight. Maximum security. Like hell they are. Malcolm's voice was steel. He picked up his phone. Execute the warrants. Now. Across the city, federal agents moved into position. Teams surrounded Precinct 18, while others headed for the homes of Judge Whitaker, Mayor Kensington, and Chief Callahan. The net was closing. Inside her cell, Eleanor heard the increased activity, the urgent footsteps, the nervous conversations. Officer Mitchell appeared with transfer papers. Time for a little trip, he sneered. but Eleanor could see the fear behind his bravado. Before Mitchell could open the cell, the precinct's front doors burst open. Federal marshals poured in, weapons drawn, badges displayed. "Federal agents, everyone stay where you are." The chaos that followed was almost beautiful in its precision. Officers were separated, phones and computers were seized, and files were secured before anyone could destroy them. Mitchell found himself face down on the floor, being cuffed by a marshal who showed none of the gentleness he'd denied Eleanor. Chief Callahan tried to run for his back office, likely heading for the shredder that had saved him so many times before. He made it 3 steps before being tackled by federal agents. Through it all, Eleanor sat calmly in her cell, watching justice finally catch up to those who had thought themselves above it. When the cell door opened, it wasn't Mitchell or Harris holding the key, but a federal marshal with respect in his eyes. "Mrs. Davis, we're here to escort you out." Eleanor stood, straightening her clothes with dignity. As she walked through the precinct, she saw the results of her patience and observation. Officers in handcuffs, evidence being boxed and labeled, computers being seized. Her eyes met Detective Lisa Carter's across the room, and she gave the younger woman a slight nod of acknowledgement. Outside, television news crews had already gathered, their cameras capturing the moment as federal agents led out the corrupt officers who had thought themselves untouchable. Eleanor emerged into the evening air, her head high, her spirit unbroken. Malcolm was waiting by a black SUV, his usual composed demeanor cracking slightly at the sight of his mother. "Mom," he stepped forward, embracing her. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, son," Eleanor patted his cheek. "But we have work to do. I've seen enough in there to keep your office busy for months." Malcolm helped her into the SUV, then turned to his team. "I want every piece of evidence cataloged and secured, every computer analyzed, every file examined. No one sleeps until we understand the full scope of this operation." As they drove away from Precinct 18, Eleanor watched through the window as more federal vehicles arrived. She saw Mayor Kensington being led out of City Hall in handcuffs, his usual swagger replaced by shocked disbelief. News helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights illuminating the unfolding drama. "They never saw it coming," Eleanor remarked, her voice carrying a hint of satisfaction. "All that power, all that corruption, and they were undone by underestimating an old woman." Malcolm smiled, recognizing the teacher's tone in his mother's voice. "They gave you 24 hours to observe their operation. That was their biggest mistake." "One of many," Eleanor agreed. "But there's more, Malcolm. What I saw in there, what I heard, it goes beyond just this precinct. They have connections throughout the system. Judges, politicians, business leaders. We'll find them all," Malcolm promised. "Every last one." The SUV turned onto the highway, heading toward the federal building where teams of investigators were already assembling. Eleanor Davis sat straight in her seat, her mind already organizing the evidence she would present. She had spent decades teaching young minds to think critically, to question authority, to stand up for what was right. Now she would teach one final lesson, this time to those who had forgotten that justice, though sometimes slow, was inevitable. In offices across the city, phones were ringing as corrupt officials realized their time was up. Judge Whitaker canceled his dinner reservations and called his lawyer. Mayor Kensington's assistant was shredding documents when federal agents burst into her office. Chief Callahan sat in a holding cell, much like the one he had put Eleanor in, wondering how it had all fallen apart so quickly. But they all knew, even if they wouldn't admit it. They had made the crucial mistake of assuming that power meant impunity, that their badges and titles made them untouchable. They had forgotten that justice could come from unexpected places. In this case, from a 78-year-old former teacher who had spent her life preparing others to fight for what was right. As night fell over the city, Eleanor Davis watched. From the federal building, as the empire of corruption began to crumble, teams of investigators worked through the evidence she and Detective Carter had provided, building a case that would shake the city's power structure to its core. "You know they'll try to fight back," Malcolm said. Standing beside her at the window, Eleanor smiled, the same smile that had encouraged generations of students to believe in themselves. "Let them try. We have something they don't." "What's that?" "The truth," Eleanor replied simply. And after all these years, I've learned that the truth, when properly presented, is the most powerful weapon of all. Malcolm nodded, understanding that his mother had just taught him one more lesson. As federal agents continued to process evidence and build their case, Eleanor Davis stood watch, knowing that her 24 hours in a cell had set in motion changes that would reshape the city's future. The storm she had promised had arrived, and it was only beginning to gather strength. The morning after the federal raid on Precinct 18 dawned cold and gray. In his private chamber, Judge William Whitaker paced frantically, phone pressed to his ear. The local news was running constant coverage of the previous night's events, and his name had already been mentioned in connection with the investigation. "We need to contain this," he barked into the phone. "Find something on the kid who recorded the arrest." "What was his name?" "Jordan Carter." Chief Callahan's voice was strained, even through the phone. Though released on bail, the police chief was clearly feeling the pressure. "But sir, with the feds involved, I don't care about the feds," Whitaker cut him off. "Frame the boy if you have to. We need to discredit any potential witnesses before they can testify." Across town, Officers Mitchell and Harris were already putting the plan in motion. They sat in their unmarked car outside Jordan Carter's apartment building, watching as the young man left for his early morning shift at the local computer repair shop. "Remember," Mitchell muttered, checking his weapon, "make it look convincing." They waited until Jordan was halfway to his car before making their move. Mitchell stepped out, badge displayed. "Mr. Carter, we need to speak with you about a robbery that occurred last night." Jordan froze, his keys clutched tightly in his hand. He remembered all too well their last encounter at Thompson's Market. "I was home all night. I have witnesses." Harris circled behind him, and Jordan felt his heart rate spike. He knew what was coming, had seen this scene play out too many times before. Witnesses can be mistaken. Mitchell's smile was cold as he reached for something in his jacket. Sometimes they remember things differently after they've had time to think. The small bag of drugs appeared in Mitchell's hand as if by magic, and Jordan's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what was about to happen, knew that his life was about to change forever, and there wasn't a thing he could do about it. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. From across the street, a small red light blinked in the early morning darkness. Detective Lisa Carter sat in her own unmarked car, her camera recording everything. She'd anticipated this move, known they would try to silence potential witnesses. As she watched Mitchell plant evidence, she pressed send on a pre-written email to Malcolm Davis's office, complete with her current location and live video feed. The next few minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Just as Mitchell moved to discover the planted drugs, 3 unmarked federal vehicles converged on the scene. Mitchell and Harris found themselves face down on the wet pavement, their own handcuffs being used against them. Jordan stood frozen, watching as federal agents collected the planted evidence and documented the scene. A gentle hand touched his arm, and he turned to find Lisa Carter beside him. "You're safe now," she said quietly, "but we need to get you somewhere secure. They'll try again." Inside his chambers, Judge Whitaker was working on another angle. He drafted an emergency gag order, citing national security concerns and potential prejudice to ongoing investigations. His clerk, Amanda Pierce, watched with growing unease as he backdated the document. "Sir," she ventured carefully, "this order, it won't hold up under federal scrutiny." Whitaker's laugh was harsh. "It doesn't need to hold up forever, just long enough for us to clean house." He stamped the order with more force than necessary. "Get this to every news outlet in the city. Anyone who violates it faces contempt charges." But he had underestimated the speed at which Malcolm Davis worked. By the time the gag order reached the news desks, Malcolm had already leaked selected portions of the evidence to key journalists. The story was spreading like wildfire across social media, far beyond Whitaker's jurisdiction. At the federal building, Eleanor Davis sat with a team of investigators, methodically going through her statement. Every detail she had observed during her detention was being cross-referenced with Detective Carter's evidence and the precinct's own records. "Mrs. Davis," Special Agent Rachel Thompson leaned forward. "You mentioned overhearing conversations about a protection racket. Can you elaborate?" Eleanor's recall was perfect, her teacher's memory serving her well. Officer Wilson was quite proud of their system. Every business in their jurisdiction paid monthly security fees. Those who refused faced constant harassment, health code violations, parking tickets, mysterious break-ins. As she spoke, another team was following the money trail. The security fees had been laundered through a series of shell companies, all leading back to accounts controlled by Mayor James Kensington and his associates. The mayor himself was attempting damage control. He called a press conference on the steps of City Hall, his usual confident smile firmly in place despite the pressure. "These allegations are completely unfounded," he declared to the assembled reporters. "Mrs. Davis's arrest was unfortunate, but it was handled according to standard procedures. Any suggestion of systemic corruption is simply a misunderstanding." In the crowd, journalists who had received Malcolm's evidence package exchanged knowing looks. They had seen the proof, the doctored reports, the financial records, the recovered body cam footage. The mayor's words rang hollow against the weight of evidence mounting against him. But the real drama was unfolding at Precinct 18. Detective Lisa Carter had returned to clear out her desk, knowing her position there was now untenable. As she packed her belongings, she could feel the hostile stares of her former colleagues. Officer Sarah Turner, once a friend, approached her desk. "You betrayed us, Lisa. Everything we built here, everything we worked for, you threw it all away." Lisa continued packing, her movements deliberate. "What we built was wrong, Sarah. What we worked for was corruption, pure and simple. We kept order." Sarah's voice was hard. "We made this city safe. Safe for whom?" Lisa finally looked up. "Safe for the wealthy? For the connected? What about people like Jordan Carter? Like Eleanor Davis? When were they ever safe in our city?" Before Sarah could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Federal agents were back, this time with more specific warrants. They headed straight for the records room, where decades of case files were stored. Lisa watched as her former colleagues scrambled to appear cooperative while subtly attempting to destroy evidence. But it was too late. Malcolm's team had already accessed the precinct's backup servers, and every deleted file, every altered report was being recovered. In his private office, Chief Callahan received an urgent call from Mayor Kensington. "This goes away," the mayor's voice shook with barely controlled rage. "Or you do. Understand?" Callahan understood perfectly. He had been the mayor's fixer for years, handling delicate situations, making problems disappear. But this time was different. This time they were facing an opponent who couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bought, and couldn't be silenced. He made one last desperate move, ordering his most trusted officers to target Lisa Carter. "She's the weak link," he told them. "Remove her from the equation, and this all falls apart." But Lisa was already one step ahead. As two officers approached her car that evening, they found themselves surrounded by federal agents. Malcolm had anticipated this move too, ensuring that the key witness in his case remained protected. The next morning, the city woke to breaking news. Judge Whitaker's gag order had been overturned by a federal judge, and the full story was finally reaching the public. News helicopters circled over Precinct 18, capturing footage of federal agents carrying out box after box of evidence. Eleanor Davis watched the coverage from Malcolm's office, her expression serene. "They never understood," she mused, "that their real mistake wasn't arresting me. It was believing that their power made them untouchable." Malcolm nodded, reviewing the latest reports from his investigation team. "They've been operating like this for so long they forgot that the law applies to them too." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah Williams entered, her face grave. "Sir, we've got a situation. Detective Carter's cover has been compromised. Someone leaked her home address to some of Callahan's people." Malcolm's response was immediate. "Get her out. Now. Full protective custody." But again, Lisa Carter proved she was always thinking ahead. When Callahan's men arrived at her house, they found it empty. She had already moved to a safe house, taking with her even more evidence, old case files, recorded conversations, and a detailed ledger of every bribe, every cover-up, every abuse of power she had witnessed over the years. The ledger proved to be the key that unlocked everything. Hidden in an old evidence locker, it contained years of meticulous records. Dates, amounts, names of officers involved in various schemes. Lisa had been building her case slowly, carefully, waiting for the right moment to expose it all. As federal agents pored over the ledger, patterns emerged. The corruption wasn't limited to just Precinct 18. It reached into other precincts, other departments, other cities. The protection racket was just the tip of the iceberg. Mayor Kensington, realizing the extent of the evidence against him, made one last desperate move. He called an emergency press conference, intending to paint himself as a reformer who had been working to expose the corruption all along. But as he approached the podium, he found Malcolm Davis waiting for him. "Mr. Mayor," Malcolm's voice carried, across the stunned crowd, "I believe these belong to you." He held up a stack of financial records. "Would you care to explain why millions in seized assets were diverted to offshore accounts in your name?" The mayor's face went pale. He turned to flee but found his path blocked by federal agents. His arrest, broadcast live on every local channel, marked a turning point in the investigation. Back at the federal building, Jordan Carter provided his statement, describing not only Eleanor's arrest, but years of systematic harassment and corruption he had witnessed in his neighborhood. His testimony, combined with Lisa's evidence and Eleanor's observations, painted a damning picture of a system rotted from within. Judge Whitaker made one final attempt to salvage the situation. He called an emergency hearing, hoping to use his authority to suppress the mounting evidence. But as he entered his courtroom, he found it packed with federal prosecutors, journalists, and Eleanor Davis herself, sitting calmly in the front row. The judge's hands shook as he took his seat. Before he could speak, a federal marshal approached the bench with a warrant for his arrest. The evidence in Lisa's ledger had included detailed records of every case he had fixed, every bribe he had accepted. As Whitaker was led from his own courtroom in handcuffs, Eleanor stood. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment the judge finally understood. They had all underestimated her, had seen only an elderly black woman they thought they could intimidate. They had never imagined that she would be the catalyst for their downfall. The day ended with more arrests, more evidence seized, more corrupt officials facing the consequences of their actions. Lisa Carter, secure in her safe house, continued providing information to Malcolm's team, helping them unravel decades of corruption. Eleanor Davis returned home that evening, finally able to rest in her own bed. But her work wasn't finished. She knew that exposing the corruption was only the first step. The real challenge would be ensuring that what happened to her couldn't happen to anyone else. As she sat in her favorite chair, she could hear the television in the background, reporting on the day's events. The storm she had promised had arrived, and it was changing the landscape of power in ways none of them had imagined. In his office, Malcolm Davis worked late into the night, building the cases that would bring justice to those who had thought themselves above the law. On his desk sat his mother's pearl necklace, recovered from the precinct's evidence room, a reminder of why this fight mattered and who had started it all. The storm was far from over, but the winds of change were blowing strong, and nothing would ever be the same. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the federal courthouse as Eleanor Davis emerged from her son's SUV. The crowd that had gathered outside erupted at her appearance, journalists shouting questions, photographers jostling for position, supporters holding signs demanding justice. But Eleanor didn't hurry or hide. Instead, she paused at the top of the steps, turned to face the cameras, and spoke with the clear, commanding voice that had controlled classrooms for over 4 decades. "I am not afraid," she declared, her words cutting through the chaos. "Justice will be served." The statement was brief, but its impact was immediate. Social media exploded with clips of the 78-year-old former teacher staring down corruption with unwavering dignity. Inside the courthouse, Malcolm Davis watched the scene unfold on a monitor, a small smile playing at his lips. He knew, that look in his mother's eyes. It was the same one she'd worn when facing down school board officials who tried to cut funding for disadvantaged students. But the morning's drama was just beginning. As Eleanor made her way through security, another figure burst through the courthouse doors. Angela Carter, Jordan's mother. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched a piece of paper. "Mrs. Davis," she called out, her voice breaking. "Please, I need your help. They're going to kill my boy." Eleanor reached for the woman's hands, steadying them in her own. "Tell me everything, Mrs. Carter." Angela's words tumbled out in a rush. Jordan, still in custody on fabricated robbery charges, had been transferred to a maximum security facility, known for its unfortunate accidents involving witnesses in police corruption cases. "He's just a boy," Angela sobbed. "He was just trying to help you." Malcolm, who had joined them in the courthouse lobby, took the transfer order from Angela's hands. His expression darkened as he read. "Judge Whitaker's signature," he noted. "His last act before being arrested." "Get him out." Eleanor's voice was steel. "Now." Malcolm was already moving, phone in hand. "Sarah, I need an emergency hearing, and get me everything we have on incident reports from that prison. Focus on witnesses who never made it to trial." The machinery of federal justice began to move, but they were racing against time. In his cell, Jordan Carter was already experiencing the special treatment reserved for those who crossed the thin blue line. The guards, many with connections to Precinct 18, made sure he understood just how alone he was. Back in the courthouse, Judge Rebecca Anderson's courtroom was filling up for what was supposed to be a routine hearing. Instead, she found herself facing an urgent motion from the U.S. Attorney General himself. "Your Honor," Malcolm stood before the bench, his presence commanding attention. "We have evidence that Jordan Carter's transfer was ordered specifically to prevent his testimony in an ongoing federal investigation." The prison's attorney, David Mike Thompson, rose to object. "Your Honor, this is simply a standard security procedure. Mr. Carter is charged with a violent felony. A felony fabricated by the very officers he was prepared to testify against," Malcolm countered, producing Lisa Carter's latest evidence, security footage showing officers Mitchell and Harris planting evidence at the scene of Jordan's arrest. "Judge," Anderson leaned forward, studying the footage carefully. After what seemed like an eternity, she spoke. "This court orders the immediate transfer of Jordan Carter to federal custody." But even as the order was being processed, another drama was unfolding in courtroom 3. Judge Whitaker might have been arrested, but his replacement, Judge Michael Sullivan, seemed determined to maintain the status quo. Eleanor's civil case against the police department was being systematically dismantled. "The court finds insufficient grounds for these allegations," Sullivan declared, his gavel falling with finality. "Case dismissed." Eleanor sat in the front row, her expression unchanged as her attorney immediately filed an appeal. They had anticipated this move. Sullivan's connections to the old guard were well documented. In Lisa's ledger, this dismissal was just another piece of evidence showing how deep the corruption ran. Malcolm, arriving from Jordan's hearing, was furious. "They're still trying to play by their old rules," he muttered to his mother. "They haven't realized the game has changed." "Then let's change it more dramatically," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying just far enough to reach the journalists in the gallery. The afternoon brought a new wave of revelations. A determined journalist named Rachel Stevens, working with the evidence Malcolm had leaked, published a devastating exposé. The article detailed not just individual acts of corruption, but an entire system designed to protect itself while preying on the vulnerable. The story spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with shared experiences. Other victims of Precinct 18's corruption coming forward, former officers speaking out, even court clerks revealing patterns of suspicious case dismissals. The wall of silence that had protected the corrupt system for so long was crumbling. In response, the police union called an emergency press conference. Their spokesperson, Frank Miller, stood before the cameras attempting to spin the narrative. "These allegations are an attack on every hard-working officer," he declared. "We stand behind our members." But his words rang hollow as more evidence emerged. Lisa Carter's ledger had been thorough, documenting not just crimes, but the system that enabled them. Each entry was a thread that, when pulled, revealed more corruption, more abuse, more lives destroyed by those sworn to protect them. The courtroom reconvened late in the afternoon, now packed with press and public alike. The tension was palpable as Eleanor took the stand. She had waited for this moment, prepared for it during those long hours in her cell. "Mrs. Davis," her attorney began, "please tell the court what you witnessed during your detention." Eleanor's testimony was devastating in its precision. She recounted conversations, described procedures, named names. Her teacher's memory served her well as she reconstructed the casual corruption she had observed. The gallery sat in stunned silence as she described officers joking about planting evidence, judges fixing cases, officials accepting bribes. Chief Callahan, seated at the defense table, began to sweat as Eleanor described overhearing his phone conversations about destroying evidence. His attorney passed him a note. "We need to discuss a deal." But it was too late for deals. Malcolm's team had been building their case methodically, using Eleanor's testimony as a framework to hang the mountain of evidence they had gathered. Financial records confirmed her account of bribes. Recovered body cam footage verified her description of events. Lisa's ledger provided dates and details that matched Eleanor's recollections perfectly. The prosecution began calling witnesses, small business owners who had paid protection money, citizens who had been falsely arrested, officers who had been forced to participate in the corruption or risk their careers. Each testimony built upon the last, creating a picture of systematic abuse that could no longer be ignored. During a brief recess, Eleanor sat in a small conference room with Malcolm and his team. The walls were covered with photos, documents, and diagrams showing the web of corruption they had uncovered. At the center was a photo of Precinct 18. "They thought the system would protect them," Malcolm observed, studying the evidence. "They never imagined it could be turned against them." Eleanor touched the pearl necklace at her throat, returned to her after being lost in evidence. "They forgot that systems can be changed, son. That's what I taught my students for 40 years." The afternoon session brought a parade of forensic accountants, detailing the complex financial schemes that had enriched Callahan, Judge Whitaker, and Mayor Kensington. The jury's eyes widened as the numbers grew. Millions in stolen assets, bribes paid through shell companies, evidence room property mysteriously disappearing. But it was the human cost that truly captured their attention. Jordan Carter, now safely in federal custody, testified about years of harassment and profiling. His voice shook as he described the night of Eleanor's arrest, the terror he felt when Mitchell threatened him, the helplessness of watching justice being perverted. "I knew what they would do to me," he said, his eyes meeting Eleanor's. "But I couldn't just watch, not again, not after seeing how they treated Mrs. Davis." The defense attorneys tried to shake his testimony, to paint him as a troublemaker with a grudge against police, but Jordan's sincerity, combined with the mountain of evidence supporting his account, made their efforts seem desperate and hollow. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom remained packed. Nobody wanted to miss a moment of what was becoming a historic dismantling of corruption. Eleanor sat in the front row, her posture perfect, her gaze steady, as more witnesses came forward. A former court clerk testified about being ordered to backdate documents. A businessman described how officers had demanded protection money, threatening his family when he refused to pay. A rookie cop, voice trembling, recounted being forced to falsify reports or face retaliation. Each testimony added another crack to the foundation of corruption, another blow to the system that had seemed untouchable just days before. The jurors took endless notes, their expressions growing more troubled with each revelation. Chief Callahan watched his empire crumbling, his face growing paler with each damning testimony. His attorneys huddled around him, whispering urgently about plea deals and cooperation agreements. But Malcolm had already made it clear, there would be no deals, no easy outs, no quiet resignations. The day ended with a powerful piece of evidence, the recovered dashcam footage from Eleanor's arrest. The defense had claimed it was lost due to technical difficulties, but Lisa Carter had found it, buried deep in encrypted files. The footage showed everything: the unlawful arrest, the excessive force, the casual cruelty of officers who thought they would never be held accountable. As the video played, Eleanor watched the jury's reactions. She saw the shock in their eyes, the disgust on their faces, the growing understanding that this wasn't just about one arrest or one precinct. This was about a system that had failed its most fundamental purpose, to serve and protect all citizens equally. The judge called for adjournment as the sun was setting. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, with protesters demanding justice, mixing with reporters waiting for statements. Eleanor emerged into the fading light, her head high, her spirit unbroken. A young reporter pushed forward. "Mrs. Davis, how do you feel about today's testimonies?" Eleanor paused, considering her words carefully. "Today we saw the beginning of change," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "But it's only the beginning. True justice requires more than just punishing the guilty. It requires building something better in place of what was broken." As she walked to the waiting car, supported by her son's steady arm, Eleanor thought about all the lives touched by this corrupt system. She thought about Jordan Carter, about the business owners forced to pay bribes, about the innocent people sitting in cells based on falsified evidence. The storm she had promised was here, and it was doing more than just destroying the old order. It was clearing the way for something new, something better. And Eleanor Davis, 78 years old and unbowed, was leading the charge. Malcolm helped her into the car, then paused before closing the door. "You know they'll appeal. Try to drag this out." Eleanor smiled, the same smile that had encouraged countless students to believe in themselves, in justice, in the possibility of change. "Let them try," she said. "We have something they never expected." "What's that?" "The truth," Eleanor replied, "and the courage to speak it." As the car pulled away from the courthouse, Eleanor watched the crowd in the rearview mirror. Signs waved, cameras flashed, voices called for justice. The system that had seemed so impenetrable was cracking, its foundations shaken by the very people it had tried to silence. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned, and Eleanor Davis, former teacher turned catalyst for change, was ready for whatever came next. She had spent her life preparing others to fight for justice. Now she was showing them how it was done. The video hit social media at exactly 3:17 a.m. Grainy footage from inside the holding cells at the maximum security facility where Jordan Carter had been briefly detained. The timestamp showed it was from 2 days ago, and the images were brutal. Officers William Peters and Scott Davidson, both with known connections to Precinct 18, could be clearly seen entering Jordan's cell after the cameras were supposed to be off for the night. What they didn't know was that Lisa Carter had allies in the facility's IT department. The backup system she'd helped install years ago caught everything: the beating, the threats, the warnings about what happened to people who testified against police. Within hours, the footage was everywhere. Hashtags trended. Phone lines at the mayor's office crashed from the volume of calls. News helicopters circled over downtown as crowds began to gather spontaneously outside the courthouse, Precinct 18 and City Hall. Police Chief Callahan, under house arrest, but still monitoring. Police channels watched the situation spiral beyond his control. His phone rang, a secure line he thought couldn't be traced. "This ends now." Mayor Kensington's voice was tight with panic. "Every piece of evidence, every record, every file, destroy it all. I don't care how." But it was already too late. Federal agents had quietly secured every records room, every computer system, every evidence locker in the precinct. The mayor's order to destroy evidence only added another charge to the growing list against him. Inside his palatial office, Kensington was growing desperate. He'd called an emergency meeting with his biggest donors, the power brokers who had helped maintain the corrupt system for decades. They gathered in a private dining room at the exclusive Summit Club, 50 stories above the growing chaos in the streets. "Gentlemen," Kensington addressed the room of wealthy businessmen and civic leaders, "we have a situation that requires immediate attention. Our investment in this city's leadership is at risk." Richard Hamilton, a real estate developer who'd benefited from years of rigged zoning decisions, spoke first. "How much to make this go away? We can set up a fund, pay off whoever needs paying." "It's beyond that now," another donor, Banking executive William Foster interjected. The feds are involved. That changes everything. As they discussed options, none of them noticed the small red light blinking beneath the crystal centerpiece, another of Lisa Carter's carefully placed recording devices. Every word, every scheme, every admission was being transmitted directly to Malcolm Davis's office. Meanwhile, at the federal building, Malcolm's team was following the money. Financial analyst Jessica Reynolds had spent sleepless nights tracing the complex web of transactions that funded the corruption. Look at this. She pointed to a series of transfers on her screen. Every time the police conducted a civil asset forfeiture, the seized funds were supposed to go into city accounts. Instead, they were diverted through a series of shell companies. Final destination? Offshore accounts controlled by Kensington and his donors. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars meant for community programs, police training, and civic improvements had instead enriched the corrupt officials and their allies. The paper trail was complex but undeniable. Malcolm studied the evidence, his expression grim. How long has this been going on? At least 15 years, Jessica replied. Maybe longer. They got sloppy recently, probably thought they were untouchable. The investigation was expanding by the hour. More whistleblowers came forward, encouraged by Lisa Carter's example. A clerk from the permits office revealed how building inspections were rigged to favor certain developers. A former police dispatcher detailed how response times were deliberately delayed in neighborhoods that couldn't pay for enhanced protection. Each revelation fueled the public's anger. The crowds outside city buildings grew larger, more vocal. Signs demanded justice, reform, accountability. Local news crews broadcast live as protesters shared their own stories of encounters with corrupt officers. Inside his chambers, Judge Sullivan desperately tried to maintain control. He issued injunction after injunction, attempting to suppress evidence and silence witnesses. But federal judges overturned his orders as quickly as he could write them. His clerk, Mary Williams, watched with growing concern as the judge's behavior became more erratic. When he ordered her to backdate a series of documents, she quietly added another piece of evidence to the growing case against the corrupt system. The mayor made one last attempt to control the narrative. He called a press conference on the steps of City Hall, surrounded by carefully selected supporters. But as he approached the podium, the wind carried the sound of protesters' chants from the street below. "My fellow citizens," he began, his usual confident smile nowhere to be seen. "What we're witnessing is a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by media sensationalism and outside agitators." From the press corps, Rachel Stevens stood up. "Mr. Mayor, can you explain these bank transfers?" She held up documents showing millions moving from seized assets to private accounts. "Or perhaps you'd like to comment on this morning's conversation at the Summit Club." Kensington's face went pale. How could they know about that meeting? His eyes darted to his security detail, looking for an escape route, but federal agents were already moving through the crowd, warrant in hand. The mayor turned and ran, pushing, past staffers and reporters. He made it to the private elevator that led to the building's secure parking garage, but when the doors opened, he found himself face to face with Malcolm Davis. "Going somewhere, Mr. Mayor?" In that moment, Kensington knew it was over. The system he'd helped build, the power structure he'd maintained through bribes and threats, and corruption, was crumbling around him. As agents led the mayor away in handcuffs, cameras captured every moment. The image of the once powerful man, head bowed, being escorted to a waiting federal vehicle, became the symbol of the day's events. But the biggest revelation was yet to come. Federal agents raiding the mayor's mansion discovered a hidden room behind his private study. Inside were files dating back decades, detailed records of every bribe, every fixed case, every act of corruption that had helped maintain their power. He kept trophies, Sarah Williams remarked as she reviewed the files. Records of everyone he owned, everything he controlled. Malcolm nodded grimly. Probably thought it was insurance. Instead, he gave us everything we need to take down the entire network. The files revealed corruption far beyond what they'd initially suspected. Judges, politicians, business leaders. The tentacles of corruption reached into every corner of city government. Each document, each photograph, Each recorded conversation added another name to the investigation. At the federal courthouse, Eleanor Davis sat with Jordan Carter and his mother watching the news coverage of the mayor's arrest. Jordan's bruises were still visible, but his eyes were clear and determined as he reviewed his testimony for the grand jury. "They thought they could silence us," he said quietly, "make us too afraid to speak up." Eleanor patted his hand. "Fear is their weapon, Jordan. Truth is ours." Outside, the crowds had grown larger still, but the anger was transforming into something else: determination. Community leaders spoke about reform, about oversight, about building a better system. The people were no longer just protesting, they were demanding change. In his private jet, attempting to flee to a country without extradition, Judge Whitaker received word that his accounts had been frozen. Every escape route he'd prepared, every safeguard he'd established, had been anticipated and blocked. The federal agents waiting on the tarmac were almost an afterthought. As they led him away, Whitaker finally understood what Eleanor Davis had known from the beginning. The power they'd thought made them untouchable had become the instrument of their downfall. Back at Precinct 18, officers watched in stunned silence as federal agents continued their methodical collection of evidence. Computers were seized, files were boxed, and decades of corruption were exposed to the light of day. Detective Lisa Carter, now under federal protection, provided the key to unlocking countless cases of abuse and corruption. Her testimony, combined with her years of collected evidence, painted a picture of systematic failure that could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just about the money, she explained to federal investigators. It was about power, the ability to control people's lives, to decide who deserved justice and who didn't. The investigation expanded beyond the city limits. Other precincts, other jurisdictions, other power structures came under scrutiny. The pattern that emerged was clear. What had happened at Precinct 18 wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a deeper problem. Malcolm Davis worked through the night, coordinating with federal prosecutors to build cases that would stick. The evidence was overwhelming, but he knew from experience that power didn't surrender easily. "They'll fight back," he warned his team. "They still have resources, allies, influence. We need to be thorough. No loose ends." In the holding cells of the federal building, the enormity of their downfall was beginning to sink in for the arrested officials. Mayor Kensington, separated from his designer suits and creature comforts, looked every bit his age. Chief Callahan, no longer in command, sat silently in his cell, refusing to speak even to his lawyers. But it was Judge Whitaker who finally broke. After decades of wielding power from the bench, of deciding others' fates while enriching himself, he found himself facing justice from the other side. "I want to make a deal," he told federal prosecutors. "I can give you names, dates, details, people you don't even know about yet." Malcolm listened to the judge's desperate offer with cold satisfaction. "No deals," he replied. "You had years to do the right thing. Now you face the consequences." The day ended with more arrests, more evidence seized, more corrupt officials, facing the justice they had denied others. Lisa Carter, from the safety of her protected location, continued providing information to Malcolm's team, helping them unravel decades of corruption. Eleanor Davis watched it all unfold with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime fighting for change. She knew that exposing corruption was only the first step. The real work, rebuilding trust, establishing accountability, creating real change, was still to come. As night fell over the city, the crowds remained, their candles and phone lights creating a sea of illumination in the darkness. They were no longer just demanding justice. They were witnessing its arrival. In his office, Malcolm reviewed the day's developments with his team. The mayor's hidden files had opened dozens of new investigations. The judge's attempted flight had revealed more hidden accounts. Each arrest led to new revelations, new connections, new evidence of corruption. "We're not just dismantling a corrupt precinct anymore," he told his staff. "We're exposing an entire system that failed its people." Eleanor, sitting quietly in the corner, nodded in agreement. She thought about her students over the years, how she'd taught them that change was possible, that justice was worth fighting for. Now she was showing them how it was done. The city was transforming. The outrage that had brought people into the streets was becoming a movement for real change. Community leaders were organizing, demanding oversight committees, police reform, transparent governance. As midnight approached, Eleanor stood at her son's office window, looking out over the city she'd called home for 7 decades. The lights of police vehicles and news vans still flickered in the streets below. The crowds had thinned but not dispersed, maintaining their vigil for justice. "You know," she said to Malcolm, "they thought arresting me would silence one voice. Instead, they woke thousands." Malcolm smiled, seeing in his mother's face the same determination that had guided his own career in justice. "They never understood what you taught me years ago, that real power isn't in controlling people. It's in standing up for what's right no matter the cost." The night was far from over, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But the tide had turned. The corrupt system that had seemed so impenetrable was crumbling, brought down not by force, but by the courage of those who dared to speak the truth. The storm Eleanor had promised had arrived, and it was changing everything in its path. The basement of Precinct 18 was eerily quiet at 3 a.m. Chief Callahan, out on bail through his expensive legal team's efforts, gathered his most loyal officers in the dimly lit evidence room. Officers Mitchell, Harris, Peters, and Davidson stood in a tight circle, their faces grim in the fluorescent light. "This ends tonight." Callahan's voice was barely above a whisper. "Carter and Davis are the keys. Remove them, and this whole case falls apart." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with the feds watching—" "I don't care about the feds." Callahan's controlled whisper became a harsh rasp. "Everything we built is crumbling. Either we fix this now, or we all go down." In a safe house across town, Lisa Carter sat reviewing her testimony with federal prosecutors. Years of carefully collected evidence spread across the table before her. Photos, recordings, financial records, each piece another nail in the corruption's coffin. "The bonuses were just the beginning," she explained, pointing to a spreadsheet. "Officers got paid extra for every false arrest that led to asset forfeiture. The more valuable the seized property, the bigger their cut." The lead prosecutor, Andrea Thompson, leaned forward. "And the judges?" Whitaker wasn't the only one. 3 other judges were on the payroll. They'd dismiss complaints against officers, approve questionable warrants, whatever was needed. Each had their own offshore account, managed through the mayor's financial advisor. None of them noticed the red dot of a laser sight briefly appearing on the window behind Lisa's head. Outside, in a darkened building across the street, Officer Davidson adjusted his scope. But before he could take the shot, the night erupted in light and sound. "Federal agents, drop your weapon!" Davidson found himself surrounded. Malcolm's team had anticipated this move, had been waiting for it. As agents led him away in handcuffs, they found a burner phone in his pocket, direct evidence linking him to Callahan. The chief's desperation was growing. His phone rang, Judge Whitaker calling from his holding cell. "They're offering me a deal." Whitaker's voice shook. "Full immunity if I testify about everything, the bribes, the fixed cases, the offshore accounts. Take that deal, and you won't live to testify." Callahan's threat was explicit, but Whitaker had already made his choice. Hours of interrogation had broken his resolve, and the prospect of spending his remaining years in prison had loosened his tongue. He told federal prosecutors everything: dates, amounts, names of every official they'd bribed or blackmailed. At the federal courthouse, Eleanor Davis took the stand for her final day of testimony. The gallery was packed, with journalists and citizens alike straining to hear every word. She described not just her arrest, but the systematic corruption she'd witnessed during her detention. They were so confident in their power, she testified, her voice clear and strong, that they didn't bother hiding their crimes. They discussed bribes and cover-ups openly, believing no one could touch them. Police union lawyers tried to discredit her testimony, but Eleanor's recall was perfect. She cited specific conversations, named officers present, detailed times and locations. Each point was corroborated by Lisa's evidence or the mayor's seized files. During a brief recess, Malcolm received urgent news. His team had raided Callahan's private storage unit, finding a treasure trove of blackmail material. The chief had been keeping insurance, Photos, recordings, documents that implicated dozens of powerful figures in the corruption scheme. He's been planning for this, Malcolm told his team, making sure he wouldn't go down alone. But Callahan had one more card to play. As federal agents swarmed his home with a new warrant, he slipped out through a hidden tunnel in his wine cellar. A escape route installed years ago for just such an emergency. The chief's disappearance triggered an immediate response. Roadblocks were established, airports and train stations were monitored, and his face was broadcast on every news channel. But Malcolm knew Callahan's destination before he even started running. The Canadian border was less than 4 hours away by car. Callahan had a false passport, emergency cash, and a carefully planned route using back roads and rural crossings. What he didn't know was that every step of his escape had been anticipated. As his car approached the border crossing at 3:47 a.m., Callahan felt the first flutter of hope. But when he handed over his fake passport, the border agent's expression didn't change. "Welcome back, Chief Callahan," she said calmly, signaling to concealed federal agents. The former police chief's arrest was unlike any he'd conducted. There was no excessive force, no planted evidence, no falsified reports, just the cold, impartial application of law he'd spent decades subverting. In the holding cell, Callahan finally cracked. "I want a deal," he demanded. "I'll take everyone down with me, judges, politicians, business leaders. I've got dirt on people you haven't even looked at yet." Malcolm stood outside the cell, studying the man who'd once seemed so powerful. "No deals," he replied. "But we'll listen to everything you have to say. Every name, every crime, every detail." And Callahan talked. For hours he detailed decades of corruption. He described how the system worked, how they chose their targets, how they laundered the money, how they silenced witnesses. Each revelation sparked new investigations, new arrests, new charges. The prosecution's case was now overwhelming. Video evidence showed Callahan ordering the assault on Jordan Carter. Financial records traced millions in stolen assets through his accounts. Recovered body cam footage revealed him instructing officers on planting evidence. But the most damning testimony came from his former officers. One by one, they took deals, turning on the man who'd led their corrupt enterprise. Mitchell described how they targeted minorities for false arrests. Harass detailed the protection racket they ran on local businesses. Each testimony added another layer to the mountain of evidence. In court, the prosecution presented the video of Callahan and Judge Whitaker discussing bribes. The courtroom fell silent as they watched two pillars of the justice system casually, conspiring to pervert it. "Your Honor," the prosecutor addressed Judge Anderson, "the government has established not just individual acts of corruption, but a systematic effort to undermine the very foundations of justice in this city." The defense lawyers tried to argue procedural points, to challenge evidence on technical grounds, but the weight of proof was overwhelming. Years of meticulous documentation by Lisa Carter, combined with Eleanor's testimony and Callahan's own records, painted an undeniable picture of corruption. The jury deliberation was surprisingly brief. After just 6 hours, they returned with their verdict. The courtroom hushed as the foreman stood. In the matter of the United States versus Callahan, on the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. The verdicts continued: guilty on racketeering, guilty on obstruction of justice, guilty on witness tampering. Count after count, the jury condemned not just Callahan's actions, but the entire system he'd helped create. Mayor Kensington was next. His trial revealed how deep the corruption had run. Evidence showed him receiving kickbacks from every major city contract, rigging bids to favor donors, using seized assets to fund his personal lifestyle. The mayor's arrogance had been his undoing. He'd kept detailed records of every bribe, every favor, every illegal deal. Those records, found in his mansion's hidden room, now provided prosecutors with a roadmap of corruption. Judge Whitaker's fate was sealed by his own words. Surveillance footage from his chambers showed him openly discussing fixed cases, coaching officers on how to write reports that would withstand scrutiny, arranging for evidence to disappear. The judge's sentence was particularly harsh: life in prison, with no possibility of parole. The justice system he'd corrupted now ensured he would never see freedom again. But the trials weren't just about punishment. Each proceeding revealed more about how the corrupt system had operated, how it had targeted the vulnerable, how it had protected itself. This knowledge was already being used to draft new policies, new oversight measures, new protections. Malcolm Davis stood in his office, watching as federal agents led another group of arrested officials into the courthouse. His mother sat nearby, reading letters from citizens sharing their own stories of abuse and injustice. "This is bigger than we initially thought," he said, reviewing the latest reports. "The pattern we found here, it's not unique to this city." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "Systems of power protect themselves, son. What we've done here is show that they're not invincible." The reform efforts were already beginning. Policy changes were drafted to require body camera footage to be independently monitored. Civilian oversight boards were established with real power to investigate complaints. Asset forfeiture laws were rewritten to prevent abuse. But perhaps the most significant change was in the public's consciousness. People who had once accepted police misconduct as inevitable were now demanding accountability. Communities that had lived in fear of corrupt officers were organizing, documenting, speaking out. Jordan Carter, his bruises now healed, became a symbol of this new era. His testimony about police brutality, combined with the evidence of corruption, sparked nationwide conversations about justice reform. "They thought they could silence us with fear," he told reporters outside the courthouse. "But fear only works when you're alone. Together, we're stronger than their corruption." Lisa Carter's role as a whistleblower inspired other officers across the country to come forward. Her careful documentation of corruption became a model for other investigations, showing how systematic abuse could be exposed and dismantled. The final phase of trials focused on the broader conspiracy, the business, leaders who'd profited from corruption, the politicians who'd protected it, the officials who'd enabled it. Each proceeding revealed more connections, more crimes, more abuse of power. Richard Hamilton, the real estate developer, was convicted of bribing officials to ignore building code violations. William Foster, the banking executive, was charged with laundering money from the protection racket. One by one, the powerful figures who'd thought themselves untouchable faced justice. In his cell, Callahan watched news coverage of the continuing investigations. The system he'd helped build, the power structure he'd thought impregnable, was being dismantled piece by piece. His attempt to flee had only added years to his sentence. The former chief had one last meeting with federal prosecutors. His lawyer had arranged it hoping for some last-minute leniency, but Callahan's words showed no remorse. "You think this changes anything?" he sneered. "The system will protect itself. It always does." Malcolm, sitting across from him, shook his head. "No, Chief. What you're seeing is the system correcting itself. The same laws you abused are now being used to bring you to justice." The prosecution's closing argument in Callahan's final appeal became a defining moment. The prosecutor, standing before the appeals court, spoke not just about specific crimes, but about the fundamental betrayal of public trust. The defendants didn't just break laws, she argued. They corrupted the very institutions meant to uphold them. They didn't just steal money or abuse power. They stole people's faith in justice itself. The appeals court's decision was unanimous. Every conviction was upheld. Every sentence confirmed. The corrupt officials who had once ruled the city, through fear and manipulation, would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. As news of the decision spread, spontaneous celebrations broke out across the city. People gathered in streets and parks, sharing stories of survival, of resistance, of finally seeing justice done. Eleanor Davis watched the celebrations from her son's office, her teacher's heart proud of the lesson her city had learned. The system wasn't perfect, but it could be changed. Justice wasn't inevitable, but it was possible. "What happens now?" Malcolm asked, standing beside her. Eleanor smiled, the same smile that had encouraged generations of students to believe in their own power. "Now the real work begins. Creating change is harder than exposing corruption, but we've shown it can be done." Outside, the sun was setting on a city transformed. not just by the removal of corrupt officials, but by the awakening of its citizens. People who had once felt powerless now understood their collective strength. The storm Eleanor had promised had done more than just destroy the old order. It had cleared the way for something new, something better. And she, along with countless others, would make sure that this new beginning wouldn't be wasted. Justice had finally arrived, and it would not be denied. 6 months after the verdicts, Eleanor Davis walked slowly down Adams Street, the same route that had led her to Thompson's Market on that fateful day. The neighborhood had changed, not just physically, but in spirit. Where there had once been tension and fear in the air, now there was a sense of renewed community. She paused outside the market, now under new management. The under new ownership sign sparkled in the morning sun, and through the window, she could see a diverse mix of customers shopping freely, without the suspicious glances that had once been so common. "Mrs. Davis," a young clerk waved through the window, one of her former students from years ago. The warm greeting drew smiles from other shoppers who recognized her. Eleanor had become something of a local legend, though she wore the attention with characteristic grace. "The neighborhood feels different now," observed Sarah Williams, Malcolm's chief of staff, who often accompanied Eleanor on these walks. "More alive. People can breathe easier when they're not living in fear," Eleanor replied, adjusting her pearl necklace, the same one she'd worn during her arrest. It had become a symbol of resilience for many in the community. The changes extended far beyond this single street. Precinct 18 had been permanently closed, its building now transformed into a community center focused on civil rights education and police accountability. The very rooms where corrupt officers had once plotted their schemes now hosted workshops on knowing your rights and community organizing. Lisa Carter had become a key figure in the ongoing reform efforts. Her testimony had led to investigations in other cities, and she now headed a new police integrity unit, training officers on ethical policing and helping establish accountability measures. "The old system was built on fear," Lisa explained to a group of rookie officers during a training session. "Our new approach is built on trust and transparency." Her words carried extra weight. Everyone knew the price she'd paid for standing up to corruption. The evidence room where she had once secretly gathered proof of wrongdoing was now a public meeting space. Community members could attend monthly oversight meetings there, reviewing body camera footage and police reports with civilian advisors. Jordan Carter's life had taken an unexpected turn. The journalism scholarship he received, funded by seized assets from the corrupt officials, had given him a platform to continue exposing injustice. His first major piece, published in the city's leading newspaper, detailed the human cost of police corruption through the stories of its victims. "Your courage started all this," he told Eleanor during an interview for his latest article. "When you refused to be silenced, you showed others they could speak up too." Eleanor's response was characteristic of her lifelong role as a teacher. "Courage is contagious, Jordan. Sometimes people just need to see it in action to recognize it in themselves." The impact of the case rippled through the justice system. Judge Anderson, who had presided over many of the corruption trials, now led a commission on judicial reform. Her first action was to establish new guidelines for handling police misconduct cases, ensuring they couldn't be buried or dismissed without thorough review. "The corruption we uncovered wasn't just about individuals breaking laws," she explained during a public hearing. "It was about a system that had lost its way. Our reforms must address both." In federal prison, former Chief Callahan watched these changes unfold on the news. His power, once seemingly absolute, had crumbled completely. The officers who had once fearfully followed his orders now testified against him in ongoing investigations. Mayor Kensington's fall had been particularly dramatic. His carefully maintained image as a civic leader had shattered under the weight of evidence. The offshore accounts Eleanor had first heard mentioned in her holding cell had led investigators to hundreds of millions in stolen public funds. The recovery of those funds brought unexpected benefits to the community. Under federal oversight, the money was redirected to its intended purposes: community programs, educational initiatives, and infrastructure improvements in the neighborhoods that had suffered most under the corrupt regime. Judge Whitaker's Fate served as a powerful warning to others who might abuse their authority. He died in prison 3 months into his sentence, his legacy not one of judicial wisdom, but of corruption and betrayal. His death made headlines, but few mourned his passing. The reform movement Eleanor had sparked spread beyond the city limits. Other communities, inspired by her example, began examining their own power structures. Police departments across the country faced increased scrutiny, and civilian oversight boards gained real authority. Malcolm Davis, despite offers of higher positions including a Supreme Court nomination, chose to continue his work at the grassroots level. He established a special task force focused on investigating systemic corruption in law enforcement. "What we learned from my mother's case," he explained to his team, "is that corruption doesn't just happen. It's allowed to happen when people look the other way. Our job is to keep looking, keep questioning, keep demanding accountability." Eleanor's influence was felt in unexpected ways. Law schools began using her case in their ethics courses. Police academies incorporated lessons learned from the investigation into their training programs. Community organizations developed new strategies for documenting and challenging abuse of power. The former evidence locker where she had heard officers plotting corruption now housed a civil rights library. On its walls hung photos documenting the community's struggle for justice, including one of Eleanor standing dignified in handcuffs, her head held high. Detective Lisa Carter's role as a whistleblower inspired others to come forward. A network of police integrity officers formed across the country, sharing information and strategies for identifying and preventing corruption. Her detailed documentation methods became a model for internal affairs departments nationwide. "What Eleanor Davis taught us," Lisa often said in her training sessions, "is that the most powerful weapon against corruption is the truth. Not hidden, not whispered, but spoken openly and backed with evidence." The changes weren't just institutional. Community attitudes shifted as people realized they had power to demand accountability. Neighborhood watch groups evolved into civilian oversight committees. Local businesses that had once paid protection money now contributed to community improvement funds. Jordan Carter's journalism career flourished as he continued investigating systemic injustice. His articles exposed similar patterns of corruption in other cities, leading to more investigations and reforms. The scholarship program named in his honor helped other young journalists focus on investigative reporting. "Every story matters," he told his fellow reporters. "Every voice deserves to be heard." That's what Mrs. Davis showed us when she refused to be silenced. The community center that replaced Precinct 18 became a model for similar transformations across the country. Its programs focus not just on civil rights education, but on building bridges between law enforcement and the communities they served. Officer Sarah Turner, who had once challenged Lisa Carter's decision to expose corruption, now led training sessions on ethical policing. Her perspective had shifted dramatically after seeing the positive changes reform had brought to the community. "We were wrong," she admitted during a public forum. "We thought power meant control, but real power comes from trust, from serving the community, not dominating it." Eleanor's pearl necklace, which had been lost in evidence during her arrest, became a symbol of resistance to injustice. Local artists incorporated its image into murals celebrating community resilience. Young activists wore pearl necklaces at demonstrations, honoring her legacy of dignified resistance. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some officers resigned rather than adapt to the new accountability measures. Others fought against reforms, claiming they would make policing more dangerous. But the evidence showed otherwise. Community trust led to better cooperation and safer conditions for both officers and citizens. Malcolm's decision to decline the Supreme Court nomination surprised many, but not those who knew him best. "Real change," he explained, "happens in communities, not just courtrooms. My mother taught me that justice is built from the ground up." The federal investigation she had sparked continued to uncover connections to corruption in other cities. Each new revelation led to more reforms, more accountability, more change. The storm Eleanor had promised had become a nationwide movement for justice. Former Officer Mitchell, serving his sentence in federal prison, finally showed remorse during a restorative justice session. "We thought we were above the law," he admitted. Mrs. Davis showed us that no one is untouchable when people stand together for justice. The documentation of Eleanor's case became required reading in civil rights courses. Law professors used it to demonstrate how systematic corruption could be exposed and dismantled. Police academies studied it as an example of what happens when power is abused and the importance of ethical policing. The Civilian Oversight Board that now monitored police activity included community members from all walks of life. Their monthly meetings, held in the former precinct building, ensured transparency and accountability in law enforcement operations. 1 year after the verdicts, Eleanor sat in her favorite rocking chair, reading a letter from Jordan Carter. His words captured the impact of her courage. "You changed my life, Mrs. Davis, and now I'll dedicate mine to changing others. Your lesson wasn't just about standing up to corruption. It was about believing in the power of truth to transform communities." She smiled, remembering all the students she had taught over her 40 years in the classroom. This final lesson about justice, courage, and the power of standing firm in the face of corruption might have been her most important. The community continued to heal and grow stronger. New businesses opened in storefronts that had once paid protection money. Community gardens sprouted in vacant lots that had been neglected under the corrupt regime. People gathered freely on streets that had once been zones of fear. Lisa Carter's police integrity unit became a national model. Departments across the country sent officers to learn from her experience. The detailed records she had kept during the corruption investigation were studied as examples of how to document and expose systematic abuse of power. The seized assets from corrupt officials continued to fund community improvements. Parks were renovated, schools received new resources, and youth programs flourished. The money that had once enriched corrupt officials now served the people it was meant to help. Eleanor's influence extended beyond her immediate community. Civil rights organizations studied her case as an example of how one person's courage could catalyze systemic change. Her strategy of careful observation and documentation became a model for challenging institutional corruption. The final scene of her victory played out quietly, without fanfare. Eleanor Davis sat in her rocking chair, watching the sunset through her window. On her lap lay Jordan's letter, and around her neck, the pearl necklace caught the fading light. She thought about all that had changed. The corrupt system dismantled, the community transformed, the legacy of fear replaced with hope. But more importantly, she thought about what remained constant: the power of truth, the importance of courage, and the endless work of building justice. The fight wasn't over. It never really would be. But Eleanor Davis had shown that victory was possible, that systems could be changed, that justice could prevail. Her story would continue to inspire others to stand up, speak out, and demand accountability. As darkness fell, she smiled, knowing that somewhere in the city, someone else was finding the courage to stand up for what was right. The storm she had promised had done its work, clearing the way for something new to grow, and in that growth lay the true measure of her victory. How many Eleanor Davises are out there right now, silently watching corruption unfold, gathering evidence, waiting for their moment to speak truth to power? How many systems still need to be exposed? The battle for justice never truly ends. It just finds new warriors to fight it. Like and subscribe to join us for more incredible true stories of courage and transformation. Hit that notification bell to be part of our growing community of justice seekers.